Princess Margaret, Rose of York, was born on the 21st of August 1930. A birth heralded by a 41-gun salute and the peal of church bells throughout the land. 71 years later, in the bleak setting of a council crematorium, flames consumed her illness-racked body. A sad, ignominious end for a princess full of so much promise.
She chose to be the woman she was. She chose the many affairs in her life. She chose to betray Lord Snowdon. She chose to be an adulteress.
She was a kind of royal vagabond.
You didn't step over the line with Princess Margaret because you just wouldn't dare go near the line, let alone step over it.
She was very royal and very grand, and people often complain about her being grand.
She was a terrible flirt. She was an unbelievable flirt.
Knowing Mick Jagger, I think he would have been very pleased to have had a royal notch on his bedpost.
Princess Margaret reputedly had her first sexual relationship with a woman.
Margaret was a self-obsessed snob.
She became a heavy drinking, heavy smoking, dictatorial, bitter old lady.
Tonight, 12 months after her death, a timely reappraisal of the extraordinary life of Margaret, the secret princess. The tiny Caribbean island of Mustique, paradise home of Princess Margaret for almost 30 years. Tonight, two of the princess's closest and oldest friends revisit the house for the first time since her death.
My thought is of all the happy, wonderful times I had here with her, and I feel she's here with me today.
Yet you'll find no plaque or statue here to honor the island's most famous former resident. This is, after all, a highly discreet, exclusive place where billionaires, film stars and rock idols can holiday in secluded peace. But the locals, who call their royal visitor Miss Princess, remember her with great affection.
It was quite a shock to the people on the island here to know Princess Margaret passed.
I feel like crying right now. It's sad, eh? What a nice lady. Every time she comes, it was special.
She was special.
It was Colin Tennant, Lord Glenconner, who introduced Princess Margaret to Mystique more than 40 years ago. He was a former boyfriend and confidant, anxious to give her a unique wedding gift.
Everybody was giving cocktail shakers from Aspreys. Cocktails were very popular. And I said, would you like to have a cocktail shaker or a piece of land on an island I've just bought in the Caribbean? And so she naturally had plenty of cocktail shakers and not many islands. She naturally opted for the second.
Lord Glenconner had bought the island in 1958 for £45,000. The wedding present home, Les Jolies Eaux, was built and located with security in mind, perched on a remote and inaccessible point on the island.
I don't think she was ever more happy in her life, do you?
No, I think
when she first arrived here, saw the house and started unpacking at the sink,
yes,
she was as happy as anything I've ever seen.
Absolutely. I remember with all the crates, and she put on a pair of yellow marigold gloves, and we all had to help. And she put all the china in the bath, and we had to wash it up. And she just loved it. I mean, at the many, many happy hours, I've lain here by the pool with her, and she just said, look, Anne, look at my view. There's just nothing more beautiful.
And the only thing in the world that I own.
Yes, it was the only thing that she owned.
The Mustique home became a safe haven during the stormiest period of the princess's later life. And yet it was a life that began in the most blissful, privileged and idyllic fashion. A devoted, loving family, the flamboyant Margaret was the apple of her father's eye. Then everything dramatically changed when, just 6 years old, her uncle King Edward VIII abdicated.
Did declare his irrevocable determination to renounce the throne.
Her father, the introverted, stammering George, became king, leaving her shy sister Elizabeth destined to be queen. Margaret was isolated with no real role. She even called herself second-hand Rose. She would be frustrated in romance, unable to marry her love, Peter Townsend, then trapped in a doomed marriage, left pursuing a string of failed love affairs. Yet her friends say she never lost sight of her real mission.
Well, Princess Margaret's deepest trait was loyalty. I think her mother probably had instilled into her loyalty to the crown. It wasn't only her sister, who she was, of course, very close to, but it was also an actual question of loyalty to the crown itself.
But 4,000 miles away in London, a very different account of Princess Margaret's life is being prepared in a room above a Soho restaurant. Journalist and royal reporter Noel Botham has spent over 40 years prying and probing into the troubled life and times of Princess Margaret. His collection of letters, interviews, photographs and tapes document every twist and turn of her incredible life. His conclusion? She was a woman who always lived life her way.
She was the perfect hedonist. She lived to enjoy, and to enjoy with excess.
Botham says nothing sums up this hedonism better than a glimpse at a typical day in the life of Princess Margaret in her latter years.
Breakfast, Mum.
She got up quite late in the morning, normally between about 10 and 11 o'clock. She would be woken with orange juice and with a tray. Breakfast was always the same throughout her life. She would only eat fruit. But if she felt somewhat jaded in the morning, her servant, who produced the orange juice, would be given the nod and pour a certain amount of vodka into it as a recovery drink for the princess. She really believed in the hair of the dog, and it seemed always to work for her. She would read the morning newspapers, scatter them all over her bedspread, and she would smoke in bed. She started smoking from the moment she opened her eyes, virtually. Her bath would have been run for her, her clothes would then be laid out for her, and she would dress normally the first of 3 changes in a day.
The incessant smoking was just one of the peculiarities of Princess Margaret that her chauffeur for 26 years, David Griffin, had to get used to.
She was very demanding that everything was done properly, and we followed the lines of protocol. We used to drive around in silence most of the time. Unlike other members of the royal family, we didn't go in for idle chit-chat. From Kensington Palace to Sandringham, a journey of 2.5 hours, there wasn't one word spoken in that whole time.
Before lunch, the princess would always visit her hairdresser in Knightsbridge.
The princess used to come here every day of the week, and on occasion, twice a day.
She would always have a very stiff gin and tonic before lunch, usually about 12:30, 1:45. That would be the first drink of the day, but by no means the last. It started a whole torrent of alcohol. She would have, perhaps, a glass of wine with lunch, perhaps a weak whiskey and Malvern water. The royal toast would be given after the first course, because Margaret insisted on smoking during most of her meals. And of course she obeyed the tradition that you don't smoke before the royal toast, but she made damn sure it happened early in the meal.
Some days Princess Margaret, what we call, had her Queen Victoria look on and could be very royal, more royal than the Queen.
She wasn't aware even of servants when they were performing their duties. Her footman could be in the room, and to Margaret there was nobody there.
You wouldn't actually get a good morning, you would sort of get a look or a nod, and that'd be it. And She sometimes used to correct me with my English. I'd say scones and she'd say scones.
In the early evening, David Griffin will be back on duty at Kensington Palace for an often exhausting and relentless round of dinner engagements.
One summer, Princess was out every night of the week for a period of 7 weeks. It just went on and on and on, and we just couldn't keep up with her in the end.
She would then go back to her home after theatre or dinner and perhaps sit drinking, listening to records or sitting at the piano until about 2 in the morning. Her intake for most of her life was at least a bottle and mainly whiskey.
This was a terribly insecure woman who felt worthless, who felt desperate to be admired, and did not feel admired.
Clinical psychologist Oliver James, who's analysed Princess Margaret's life, believes alcohol and tobacco were effectively drugs of solace for a tortured princess who showed all the classical symptoms of a serious personality disorder.
To a normal shrink, Princess Margaret's diagnosis, if she came into this room now and sat down and I talked to her for a bit, would be that she was a narcissistic personality disorder, that she had a me, I have to be the centre of attention personality, a sort of toad of Toad Hall. Think Paulie Yates, think practically any TV presenter you can think of. Somebody who's got to be the centre of attention, who tends to be willful, incredibly erratic in their moods, and often extremely difficult to be close to.
And the roots of this condition? Oliver James traces it back to deep inferiority, instilled from childhood.
Princess Margaret always referred to herself as second-hand Rose, her name being, of course, Margaret Rose. And she always felt that she was the second-hand, second-best person in the family. There was Elizabeth, after the abdication of her uncle, destined to become queen one day, and herself. There was the heir and the spare. She always referred to it.
She felt very inferior to everyone deep down, but she compensated for that by saying, well, actually, I may feel inferior, but I am the princess, and you jolly well better refer to me as, you know, Your Royal Highness.
Princess Margaret was very royal. People, I think, sometimes forget that. I mean, she was the daughter of the King Emperor. She'd been brought up with the Queen. They were the only, you know, in the war and just after the war. I mean, she was very royal and very grand, and people often complain about her being grand. I always expected her to be grand. I didn't expect her to be anything else, you know.
Coming up, how the Grand Princess turned Mustique into her private playground. And did the young Princess Margaret have a lesbian affair? The arrival of Princess Margaret on Mustique would always be a major event. Her appearance would transform this normally sleepy, tranquil island into a huge stage set, a beautiful location for outrageous and lavish parties.
Margaret got up to all kinds of shenanigans on Mustique, because anything went there, and whatever happened didn't happen as far as London society was concerned.
The man in charge of royal entertainment was Princess Margaret's lifelong friend and owner of Mustique, Colin Tennant, Lord Glenconner, now back on Macaroni Beach.
This beach recalls all the parties we had here. There were never less than a dozen, sometimes 20 or more people for lunch here. I would always pack it out, you know, with a lot of people. And very often that would turn into a party.
There were incidents with people running around naked. Margaret photographed quite a few of them. There was Colin Tennant and Roddy Llewellyn.
Does Lord Glenconner recall those pictures?
I'm not going to answer that kind of question.
Someone happy to recall those shameless shenanigans is former model and socialite, the Honourable Victoria Hodge.
I was privileged enough and fortunate enough to be at some of the best parties in Mustique with Princess Margaret. She was a very sexy, sensual woman. And flirtatious, and if the order of the night was a costume party, she would wear the best costume. Princess Margaret wanted to be one of us. Because of who she is, she could get away with anything, really. And did.
The man who still owns and runs Basil's Bar in Mustique surely knows the truth about those riotous royal parties.
The truth? You mean you haven't been listening?
She was longing to have fun. She was longing to be part of the party.
Those parties, they weren't just rumors, they were big parties. And of course, Colin went overboard sometime with the dress code of some of the, you know, some of the local guys.
We had like people from Trinidad, limbo dancers came up, and they all went to Macaroni, had live steel band music. We had what a part of, we call it naked dance, special dance, and so forth like that around at Macaroni. The limbo dance, very colorful, was a great party.
Any private parties that she wanted, naked limbo dancers, romancing somebody she was in love with, walking into the sunset with somebody she fancied, she could have in Mustique. If there was somebody she saw at a party who she liked or fancied, I think the first person they had to go through was her private detective. The next person would be an interview with her lady-in-waiting, and then Mam would step in. And if you were in the way, you got out of the way.
She liked the gentleman very much. I mean, if she saw somebody, she'd say, "Oh, Anne, who's that?" And, you know, I'd perhaps like to meet him, and I again ask who he was and bring him up. Yes, she did. She liked, well, like a lot of ladies do, I think she had an eye for the gentleman.
She was a terrible flirt. She was an unbelievable flirt.
Anybody that I brought to a party, she accepted. I think she felt entirely safe in my hands. I always went as near to too far as, which was, but never over the edge.
But an encounter with Cray Twins gangster and film star John Bindon, lover of Victoria Hodge, did by all accounts go well over the edge.
Margaret watched with laughter as Johnny Bindon balanced several glasses, beer glasses, on his erect penis, and thought that was a great party act.
They all came back and everybody was giggling. The lady-in-waiting said she'd seen bigger, and Princess Margaret's eyes were watering, and she was licking her lips. And John and Mam struck up a very cordial relationship. I think she was impressed. I think she thought it would be a healthy sexual conquest for her. And if I had to bow out, I would bow out. What could you do?
Princess Margaret had a wonderful mind. She was very sensuous looking, Princess Margaret. Very, very sensuous.
Princess Margaret blossomed as a beauty very early in her life. She was only about 13 or 14 when she started to develop physically and mentally to become the fascinating, seductive creature she eventually became at the age of 19. In those days, she was probably the most beautiful woman in the world. She knew her sexuality, and she deliberately set out to ensnare men from that age. She liked playing the game. It was only when she became involved with men in the Margaret set and went to weekend parties from the age of about 17 that they started to worry about whether she would get entangled with the men sexually and whether there could be a disastrous pregnancy.
Sharman Douglas, the daughter of the American ambassador, a jet-setting party girl, became a close friend of the princess.
I did meet with Sharman Douglas, and we discussed this period in her life and Margaret's life, and she confirmed that they had enjoyed asexual relationship for about 2 years. The aides around the royal family believed that it was safer for Princess Margaret to indulge in a relationship with another woman than to be with a man.
On one level, this seems astonishing and very racy, even by today's standards. But it has been suggested that this was in fact a tried and tested way of sort of almost not quite exhausting a libidinous princess, but putting her into a safe channel, somewhere where you weren't going to get pregnant, it wasn't going to get out, it wasn't going to be embarrassing that you were consorting with playboys. It would be very underground.
I'm not saying, and no evidence ever came to light, that Princess Margaret became a lesbian.
Far from it. From the age of 14, she'd been infatuated by a man who arrived at Buckingham Palace to work for her father.
Into her life, of course, stepped Peter Townsend, a very good-looking hero, the first man to shoot down an enemy plane over British soil, dashing new equerry to her father, the king. And she adored Townsend from the beginning. And this awoke in her a lot of her latent sexuality, because she's had someone to focus on.
He was very dashing, and of course he was a war hero and rightly good looking, and everybody was in love with him.
Princess Margaret was no exception. By the age of 19, her crush with this man, who was married with 2 children, had become a serious and increasingly talked about love affair. On February the 6th, 1952, Princess Margaret's beloved father, the King, died. And later that year, her sister Elizabeth became Queen.
I always remember very sad looking was Princess Margaret on her own. I think at that moment perhaps she realised that life was going to be very, very different for her. And what role did she have?
Would romance fill the void? The affair with Group Captain Peter Townsend flourished, despite substantial hurdles.
The fact that he was married and had children didn't matter a damn to Princess Margaret.
Peter Townsend had 2 sons, Giles and Hugo. Until now, they've remained silent about the upheaval in their young lives.
I have found it very difficult, and I've never spoken about it before. The first time I heard about any connection of my father with Princess Margaret was when I was at prep school. I remember it extremely well, and it was the end of a beautiful summer's day, and we were walking across the playing fields, and a boy who'd been out for the day with his parents came rushing up to the small group of boys and the master and said words to the effect, "Peter Townsend's going to marry Princess Margaret."
Distressing news for any child to overhear. Then his parents divorced, with his mother taking the blame for her affair with another man.
When he went to court for a divorce, it was Townsend who was given custody of the 2 boys, not Mrs. Townsend.
Somebody had to take the blame, and it clearly wasn't going to be my father.
The courts wanted to kiss the backsides of the royal family. By awarding custody to Townsend, they made Mrs. Townsend the villainess and the guilty party, so that Townsend would look eligible for Princess Margaret.
I shut it out of my mind 50 years ago. And just, you know, I was able to do that, and I've done it ever since, really, just shut the thing away from my mind.
With the divorce complete, the country pondered whether Princess Margaret would put love before duty and choose her war hero. In a dramatic statement, she renounced marriage.
I think Princess Margaret felt throughout her life that it was her duty to give her best and her loyalty to her sister because she was the monarch.
It's amazing how many people still believe that Peter Townsend was the great love of Princess Margaret's life. And that is nonsense. She was told by the Queen, if you want to marry Peter Townsend, you can, but you must give up your title, you must give up the £6,000 a year civil list payment, equivalent to £250,000 a year now, and you must give up your right to live in England and in a palace. Margaret said, I'm not giving those up. Now, if this woman was truly in love with Peter Townsend, she would have given everything up to live with the man she loved. She wasn't prepared to do that.
She was a very insecure woman who could not possibly live without being a princess. And of course, if she'd married Townsend, that would have been the end of her occupying this superior position.
Whenever Margaret was in trouble in later life and had committed some awful gaffe, then up would come, but of course you can forgive her, because look how she was forced to give up the great love, Peter Townsend. And within 3 months of renouncing Peter Townsend, she was unofficially engaged to a playboy called Billy Wallace. How soon to get over such a broken heart?
This young woman approached the 60s and just went off like a rocket. I mean, she wasn't one of the archetypal handbag-carrying 50s ladies that the court then consisted of. Here was a woman who, drank a bottle of whiskey in a day quite happily, smoked 60 cigarettes, hung out with pop stars. She's a rock chick, and it's extraordinary that the royal family at that time should have produced her.
Coming up, how Margaret, the rock chick princess, embraced the swinging 60s. Her doomed marriage, her many affairs, and the spy time bomb that still threatens the royal family today. Perhaps the most amazing story to emerge from Noel Boffin's investigation into the life of Princess Margaret is that a Russian spy targeted her in the 1960s.
Princess Margaret had virtually every night of her life people into the party, people to have fun. They were people from show business, they were odd people she picked up in clubs, they were strange friends from the London social set. They all had one thing in common: they loved to party till the early hours.
And no party or premiere was complete without Princess Margaret and her new husband, the photographer and future Lord Snowdon, being in attendance. But these were treacherous times.
The period of the early 60s was at the height of the Cold War. London was very much the spy capital of the world. MI5 and MI6, the Americans, the Russians, the French, the Germans, all trawled the same murky world in London. They were all after the same sort of information. The Snowdons found themselves very much the fish trapped in the middle of this net.
The net was cast by a Russian called Ivanov, the spy at the heart of the Profumo and Christine Keeler scandal that rocked the Tory government in the early 60s.
One of the amazing things about Kensington Palace is that it almost borders on the grounds to the Russian embassy. And it's from there in the Russian embassy that Captain Yevgeny Ivanov, a naval attaché but also a GRU spy for Russia, would spy on the royal family. He didn't have far to look in Margaret's case.
His remit would certainly have been to establish a biographical leverage, which was a euphemism for blackmail.
It was Stephen Ward, society osteopath and sometime pimp, who introduced Ivanov into the royal circle.
Ward became famous for his wild weekend orgies, which involved many celebrities and members of the royal family. He supplied many young girls who he chose to call popsies, and anything went at these parties. Any form of sexual deviancy was accepted.
Ward collected photographs of these parties, but mysteriously died of a barbiturate overdose only hours after he'd threatened to publish the pornographic pictures and name names.
Ivanov was able to acquire one of the 3 volumes of lurid pornographic photographs that Ward had collected over the years. It has been rumoured that Ivanov copied some of those photographs and returned those to Soviet military headquarters in Moscow.
Ivanov told me in Moscow, some years later, that they had material which was devastating for the royal family. None of that information has yet been revealed. Yet it's there, in those files. The real dynamite is still sitting in Moscow.
While spies were busy watching the Snowdons, the British media in the 1960s gave the fashionable couple nothing but admiration and deference.
There would have been a certain respect for the monarchy then, even if people in the know, newspaper editors, felt that she was overstepping the mark, perhaps a little bit too much of a playgirl. It wouldn't have been as widely reported as now. It would be almost impossible, had Princess Margaret been living now, for her not to be a centre spread of hello absolutely every week and the main fodder, really, for the Sun and the Mirror.
But in those days, the public was presented with the image of the perfect couple within the perfect marriage.
What is absolutely certain is they were physically very well suited. Apart from being about the same height, both remarkably small people, they're also very, very animalistic, if you like, in their sexual needs. Highly charged, couldn't keep their hands off one another. And they hit it off right from word go because she was passionately interested in him. Whether they were ever truly in love, I don't know.
Tony Snowdon was the father of her children and her husband for a while, but never her mad, wild love that she wanted and deserved.
I think that Princess Margaret was a dominant figure, but she happened to be drawn to, in those cases, well, in Lord Snowdon's case, to a dominant male. I think that was probably the trouble.
Theirs was a marriage in crisis, almost from the time they returned from the honeymoon. Tony would like to have friends in for drinks. He'd like to go to bed reasonably early. Margaret wanted to stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning, and of course, being the princess, nobody was allowed to go to bed. Nobody was allowed to leave until she decided to go to bed. And this grated on Tony. He loathed certain things about her. Small mannerisms became very important. He disliked the way she constantly screamed, "Where are my effing fags?" Tony would leave her wicked little notes like 20 reasons why I hate you. And he'd describe her to people at a table like a little fat manicurist.
I have a lot of thoughts about their marriage. I mean, I was there a lot of the time when they were together. And I mean, I know I've actually always taken Princess Margaret's side because she's a wonderful friend to me and I loved her. But Tony really, I think at moments, was very unkind to her. And he just had very, very little patience with her a lot of the time. I have seen him be extremely unkind.
Narcissists are just living in their own little world, people like Margaret, and you know, they have as their dictum, I am perfect. And then for a few people, they'll say, you are perfect too, but you are part of me. They do fall in love, narcissists. They really do have kind of plunging, falling in love behavior. But at the same time, of course, they have terrible, terrible disappointments. Because they've idealized this other person, they've invented this fictional other person related to that person who's an aspect of themselves, really, and then find it terribly disappointing.
And she would say, do you know who you're speaking to? And Snowdon said, yes, I'm speaking to my wife. And Margaret said, oh, no, you're not. You're speaking to Her Royal Highness, Princess Margaret, sister to the Queen, and don't you ever forget it. This was the nature of Princess Margaret, even to her husband, and he couldn't cope. They took to sniping at one another across the dinner table in front of guests. Patrick Lichfield, Lord Lichfield, the Queen's cousin, said that it was open warfare between them.
After this constant battling, there was no hope. Already their 6-year marriage that produced 2 children was all but over. Photographer Lord Snowdon volunteered for lengthy foreign assignments, and they both sought solace in the company of different lovers. Princess Margaret had a fling with Tony Barton, a close friend of her husband. Then a far more passionate, painful affair with Robin Douglas Hume, nephew of Tory Prime Minister Alec Douglas Hume. Robin confessed the whole story to Noel Botham in this private drinking club in Soho.
The usual, please. They took up where they'd left off quite a number of years before. And suddenly he was back in favour and a regular guest of Margaret's at her table.
Douglas Hume, performing here, was an old flame of the Princess, a hard-drinking, womanizing, barroom jazz pianist.
They actually made love for the first time in Kensington Palace. But Robin invited her to stay at his home down in Surrey, and she went there for the weekend. And this produced the first of her very intimate love letters, which she wrote him on a headed paper which had an M and Kensington Palace on the top.
Darling Robin.
And they each started off, Darling Robin.
Thank you for a perfect weekend.
Because she was thanking him for that first weekend that
that
they spent together in his home, which is where they made love properly for the first time.
Thank you for everything nice, which everything was. With best love, M.
But it will be a short-lived affair. Princess Margaret had always loved the world of show business and fell under the spell of comic genius Peter Sellers, abandoning a distraught Douglas Hume to his fate.
He spilled his heart out to me because he was broken-hearted. She had dumped him for Peter Sellers. She'd moved on, as Margaret did. She moved on very quickly from man to man.
A year later, while suffering depression, Robin Douglas Hume committed suicide.
By the way, I don't think much of the room service here.
And I hope the goddamn rope breaks.
Good luck, mate.
My father was, for a period of time, considered the court jester. Basically, he was invited to dinner at Kensington Palace one night by Princess Margaret, and just the two of them. And when dinner was finished and everything was served, they were sitting around the table, and all the servants retired and the doors were shut, and one thing led to another, and this was the night they consummated their relationship. And he said he remembers thinking, my God, I'm going to end up in the Tower for this. He at one point, I think to Brian Forbes, spoke about marrying Princess Margaret, and one of the things he said was she's got the same size breasts as Sophia Loren, which seemed to matter to him. Princess Margaret asked my father to introduce her to Warren Beatty. By the time they get to the gates of Kensington Palace, Warren's going, well, what are we doing here, Pete? You know, geez, what's going on? And he said, we're having dinner with Princess Margaret. So the upshot being that my father left Princess Margaret alone in Kensington Palace with Warren Beatty, one of the most well-known, is it Lotharios, I think, of the era. So I guess they had fun.
Princess Margaret was clearly a very voracious woman. She had big appetites, you could say, already fixated. There's the fags, there's the whiskey and the booze, and there's the sex. They all go together, and frankly, why have one when you can have all three?
And there was also drugs and rock and roll. Princess Margaret was a Rolling Stones fan, and personal friend of Mick Jagger.
Mick is driven by his libido, I think that's quite obvious. Princess Margaret, certainly during the mid-60s, was a stunningly beautiful woman. There were always rumours, stories that something went on between them, who knows. Knowing Mick Jagger, I think he would have been very pleased to have had a royal notch on his bedpost. Princess Margaret attended the Rolling Stones concert at Earl's Court and was backstage in their dressing rooms, and there were many rumours of what actually was being consumed in those dressing rooms.
But her reaction was, cocaine, what an amusing little drug. And they brightened up after that, and when she disappeared into the loo with a lady who was also present in the dressing room and came out with eyes sparkling and very happy, they realised perhaps this wasn't such a shocking thing for this royal guest to experience.
Mick Jagger also owned a home on Mustique, further fueling stories of a bond between the pop star and the princess. Stories that persisted till her death.
Margaret was always adamant that Mick Jagger should be given a knighthood. It was actually one of her deathbed wishes, apparently, that he receive one. And of course, lo and behold, 4 months after she passes away, what do we get? Mick Jagger, A Rise to Mick.
Coming up, The affair with toy boy Roddy Llewellyn, how Princess Margaret lost her beloved Mustique home, her failing health and tragic final days.
Princess Margaret had three principal loves in her life: her father, herself, and Roddy Llewellyn.
Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener, was a frequent visitor to Princess Margaret's home on Mustique. He was 17 years younger than the princess. They met at Lord Glenconner's ancestral home, Glen Castle in Scotland.
We were what's called short of a young man at one point, and so I rang my Aunt Violet Wyndham and said, did she know at the last minute of anyone? She suggested Roddy Llewellyn. I mean, it was quite clear that he was exactly right. You know, you hear in story tales where they fell in love at first sight. Well, that's what does happen to people.
I remember at one point, Roddy saying to me, I went for a walk with him, he said, oh, he said, I think Princess Margaret's so beautiful. She's got the most lovely eyes I've ever seen. And I said, well, Roddy, you know, don't tell me, tell her, you know. And I think he did.
Roddy was a very, very special relationship and a very important relationship to her. And I believe that they were very much in love.
He was wonderful to her. I mean, he sort of cheered her up. She absolutely loved him.
Margaret, from what her various suitors have told me, was an incredibly demanding lover. Roddy found he just couldn't cope with the princess's demands, sexual demands, physical demands on him. And he suffered almost a collapse and ran away. He jumped on the first aeroplane leaving Britain and ended up in Turkey. Princess Margaret, believing that this man with whom she had fallen passionately in love had left her for good, suffered a nervous collapse herself and took an overdose of pills and tried to commit suicide, ending up in hospital.
While Princess Margaret recovered, she insisted on a cooling-off period. But soon the couple were back together on Mustique. Then Roddy Llewellyn dropped a bombshell.
To be told by Roddy, halfway through a holiday at her home in Mustique, that he had found another woman and intended to marry her, came as an utter shock to Princess Margaret. She had no idea that Roddy had anybody else in his life, certainly no other woman in his life, and it stunned her.
I think she was one of the saddest people, over-gregarious, over-indulgent, desperately wanting fun, desperately wanting to be in the party. But her life was very sad and over when she was quite young.
It hurt her considerably, and she never really recovered from that for the rest of her life. It was such a stunning blow.
The holidays in Mustique continued for many years. By this stage, Princess Margaret no longer owned the house. She gifted it to her son to avoid death duties. Her health was failing. She suffered a stroke and then badly scalded her feet in the bath while in Mustique. The family felt it wasn't safe for the frail princess to continue staying in her isolated Caribbean home. So Les Jolies Eaux was sold.
She wasn't very happy, but I think, you know, she did miss it.
She didn't spend her last days there, as I think we had all hoped.
Princess Margaret's home was sold in a sorry state, in need of £1 million refurbishment. This is the first time Lord and Lady Glenconner have seen the house since it was redeveloped.
But I think at first glance you're rather delighted.
No, delighted. I mean, it's got
Yeah.
very much the feel that she had, she wanted.
Very clever.
I think she would have been really, really pleased.
Yeah, they're all the same.
I mean, I feel she's here now. I mean, I just feel she is.
Do you?
So, very
Yeah.
much so.
Yeah.
Princess Margaret did come back to the island for one final holiday.
For the first time, you know, somebody for nearly 30 years, and then one day you look at her, and she aged a little bit. I think that was the dramatic thing.
From the beginning of the 80s on, for 20 years, Margaret was in steady decline. There was never to be another great love in her life. There were the odd escorts, walkers, friends, many of them homosexual, but she was in steady decline. It's almost as if in dropping her, Roddy had taken away that major spark in her life. It never returned. She drank more, she smoked more, she ignored all the signs, ignored all the health warnings, didn't seem to care anymore. Didn't seem to care whether she lived or she died, whether she was fit or not, whether her weight was up or down. Didn't seem to matter. And the whole nation, I think, was shocked when they saw her at her mother's birthday celebrations, looking older than her mother, looking senile, shaking, almost palsied, not aware of what was going on around her, had to be told what was happening by a footman standing behind the wheelchair. It was a shocking picture of this once most beautiful woman.
When the princess was starting to get ill because she'd had her first stroke, when she used to be out in the car sometimes, you could see that she'd dropped off into a rather deep sleep, and being a little bit worried, I used to just put the brakes on a little bit firmly now and again, just to make sure she was still with us, and she'd wake up then.
Princess Margaret eventually gave up her lifelong habit of smoking, but it was all too late. She was in terminal decline.
To the end of her life, the one great love that Margaret never forgot, the love of a man given totally unselfishly, given absolutely to her, demanding nothing in return, was that of her father, King George VI. And Margaret loved him back fiercely in return. And she never forgot that love, right through to her dying days. And her dearest wish was that she should be buried next to that beloved father, and was quite shocked to be told there wasn't room for her. There was no room for a coffin next to his in Windsor Royal Chapel. And that's what decided Princess Margaret to have herself cremated after her death, because she discovered that there was room next to King George VI's burial place for a small casket of ashes. And that's, of course, where she was eventually buried. Her ashes were placed next to her father's. It was perhaps ironic that Princess Margaret, whose birth was greeted with a 41-gun salute and pyres all over the country, to have to be put in line to go into a public crematorium to be turned into ashes. It was the most common, most ordinary exit for such a very grand princess. This was certainly not the ending Princess Margaret Rose of England would have chosen for herself, but it was the only way she could ensure that she would lie next to her father for eternity.